In the early days of October 2025, public opinion across Brazil was shaken by a brutal murder that left a young woman dead, her body covered in open wounds. In front of her three small children, the victim was attacked with an unusual weapon that carried a disturbing, symbolic meaning, a sickle. Dozens of deep wounds, some cutting all the way to the bone and aimed at vital areas, revealed the killer's clear intention to take her life without mercy. Yet, as the investigation began, police were puzzled. The victim was known to have no serious conflicts with anyone. Her life circumstances were already difficult, and there seemed to be no obvious reason for her to provoke hatred or revenge. So why did she meet such a tragic end? Who could commit such a ruthless act against a young mother of three? Imperatriz, the second largest city in the Brazilian state of Maranhão, lies along the banks of the Tocantins River and is considered a major energy and industrial center in the region. Thanks to its strategic location and the development of hydroelectric projects, the city attracts thousands of workers from across the country. As a result, many diverse and lively residential communities have formed. However, this rapid population growth has also brought social challenges. In crowded working-class neighborhoods, unemployment, alcohol abuse, and gambling are common problems. These conditions often contribute to domestic violence, which remains a serious concern for local authorities. In some poorer communities, superstition also runs deep. Rumors surrounding macumba, a form of ritual magic, often associated with dark spiritual practices, still circulate among certain groups. Blind belief in such ideas has occasionally led to tragic consequences. It was within this social backdrop that a chilling murder took place, one that would send shivers through the entire community. Everything began on the early morning of Thursday, the 9th of October, 2025. The usually quiet atmosphere of the Planalto neighborhood was shattered by the frantic screams of children. At around 7:30 a.m., residents preparing to leave for work heard the disturbing sounds and followed them toward the end of an alley along Rua Y. Charles. What they discovered there was a scene they would likely never forget. In front of a small house, a young woman lay collapsed on the sidewalk. Dark, red stains spread across the ground around her head and arms. Beside her stood three children, the oldest about 5 years old, crying uncontrollably next to his mother. After the initial shock and horror, neighbors quickly called both the police and emergency services. Within minutes, officers from the Imperatriz Military Police and medical responders arrived at the scene. Investigator João Jr., a seasoned sergeant who was among the first officers to approach the victim, saw the young woman lying on the walkway just outside the house. It was a modest one-story residence with faded yellow walls and a rusted metal roof, a humble home shared by a young mother and her three small children. On the concrete sidewalk, the woman's body lay tilted toward the neighboring house. Blood had soaked into her clothing and spread across the ground. As investigators examined the body, they discovered numerous wounds caused by a sharp object. The victim's head alone had been struck at least 3 times, while her arms and hands bore 2 deep cuts that reached the bone. These injuries suggested she had raised her hands in a desperate attempt to defend herself. The severity and placement of the wounds made it clear that the attacker intended to kill. The blows had been aimed at vital areas, leaving the victim little chance of survival. Another chilling detail caught Sergeant Jr.'s attention. The weapon used in the attack appeared to be a sickle or a short-handled harvesting blade, typically used for cutting grass. At the scene, police discovered such a tool lying in the corner of the yard, stained with blood. Although it is a common agricultural tool, it rarely appears in urban homicide cases. Its use made the crime scene even more disturbing, evoking images of ancient and brutal rituals. This sickle would soon become one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in reconstructing what had happened. Meanwhile, the most crucial witnesses present at the scene were the victim's own children. The 3 children were completely terrified. The oldest clutched tightly to the youngest, while all of them cried uncontrollably. their small bodies trembling with fear. A female police officer quickly picked up the baby and tried to calm the child, while her colleagues gently separated the two older children from their mother's body and escorted them into a neighbor's house for safety. The heartbreaking cries of the children echoed through the scene. "Mom, please, wake up." Their sobbing voices struck deeply at everyone present, police officers and rescue workers alike. After a brief moment of sorrow, investigators forced themselves to focus on the evidence in front of them. Their initial assessment suggested the possibility of domestic violence. The woman might have been brutally attacked by her partner or someone close to her. Following that line of investigation, the police's immediate task was to confirm the victim's identity and examine her personal relationships in order to narrow down potential suspects. Fortunately, identifying her did not take long. In a handbag found near the front porch, officers discovered identification documents, along with several personal belongings. The victim was identified as Mylene Ridoasva, 20 years old, who lived in the very house where the attack occurred. Neighbors in the area quickly recognized the young woman as well. Although she had only moved there recently, a few residents were already aware of her difficult circumstances. She had given birth to her first child while still a teenager, followed soon after by two more. Despite her young age, Malin had already endured many hardships in her family and marital life. According to neighbors, her relationship with the father of the children had recently begun to fall apart. She chose to raise her three children alone. Determined to build an independent life, she moved with them from her hometown to the city of Imperatrice not long before the tragedy occurred. Although her family still lived in the countryside, she decided to start over in the Planalto neighborhood, hoping her children would have access to proper education and better opportunities. Mylene was described as a gentle and hard-working young woman who loved her children deeply. At only 20 years old, she had already become both mother and sole provider for the family. Life forced her to grow up quickly and face the pressures of survival. Each day she woke before sunrise, preparing a simple breakfast before walking her two older children to a nearby preschool. She did not yet have a stable job. From time to time, neighbors saw her taking small laundry jobs or selling items on the street to earn enough money to support her family. Despite the constant struggle, Mylene always hoped her children would grow up to have a brighter future. She lived quietly and kept mostly to herself, partly because caring for three young children left her little free time, and partly because she was still new to the area. By this point, the identity of the victim had become clear. Yet that clarity only deepened the mystery surrounding the killer. Malin had only recently moved to the neighborhood and had little interaction with the community. Who could possibly harbor such deep hatred toward her that they would commit such a brutal act? Initial verification showed that she had no debts and no connection to criminal groups. Theories involving robbery or gang conflict were quickly ruled out. The crime scene showed no signs of a struggle over property, and the attack had taken place openly outside the house. The blood-stained sickle discovered at the scene suggested that the attacker might be someone living nearby. Few people would carry such a tool, unless it came directly from their home. Investigators began checking nearby houses to see who owned similar farming tools or had behaved suspiciously. At that moment, several indirect witnesses stepped forward. Some residents told officers they believed the attacker was an older man who lived next door to Mylene. During the chaos, one person had briefly seen him running past the end of the alley while holding something resembling a sickle. Others said the man had behaved strangely even before the incident. That morning, when neighbors rushed outside after hearing the screams, the suspect had already disappeared while Malin lay collapsed on the ground. The description provided by residents matched a 5-6-year-old neighbor named Witch Guzon Martin de Sosa. He had been born and raised in the rural areas of Maranhão before later moving to Imperatrice. Wei Ginson was described as gaunt and worn-looking, with a tall, thin frame and a hollow face covered by uneven stubble. His eyes were said to shift constantly, giving him an uneasy and unsettling appearance. Neighbors said he lived a very reclusive life, rarely speaking with anyone. His personality was considered rough and unpredictable. But was he truly the person responsible? The most decisive clue came from a security camera installed on a nearby house. The camera had captured the entire attack. When investigators reviewed the footage, they were deeply disturbed by what they saw. The video showed Malin stepping outside her house when a man suddenly rushed toward her from behind while holding a sickle. The image was clear enough to reveal the attacker's face. It was indeed the neighbor, Wind Gilson Martin. In the footage, Malin collapsed but managed to get back up and staggered toward the house across the street, desperately trying to seek help. But W.J. Ginson chased after her relentlessly. He swung the sickle again and again, even as the children cried behind them. Only after Malin finally collapsed completely did the attacker stop and flee the scene. The security camera footage allowed police to clearly identify the perpetrator and reconstruct the sequence of the crime. From that point forward, the investigation shifted toward locating W.J. Ginson Martins de Sosa and uncovering the motive behind his brutal attack on the young neighbor. Once the suspect was confirmed, the Imperatriz police immediately launched an intensive manhunt. The crime scene remained secured while forensic specialists collected evidence, including blood samples, fingerprints from the sickle, and possible footprints left in the soil. At the same time, investigators spread throughout the neighborhood to gather additional witness statements. Many residents were still shaken, but tried to recall anything that might help. One young man reported seeing W.J. Ginson wandering outside early that morning, appearing agitated and restless. Another woman said that, a few days earlier, she had heard him muttering strange things. According to her, he claimed that evil spirits had told him a young woman had cast a curse on him, causing his illness and bad luck. These fragments of testimony helped investigators form a clearer picture of a man showing signs of paranoia and instability, consistent with their early suspicions. Sergeant Jr. and his colleagues quickly analyzed the situation. Because W.J. Ginson was familiar with the area, he might attempt to hide somewhere nearby or seek refuge with someone he knew. Police immediately alerted patrol units across the city, describing the suspect as a 5-6-year-old man with a tall, thin build and messy gray hair. Officers were warned that he might still be carrying a weapon or have visible bloodstains on his clothing. Throughout that morning, police radios across Imperatriz repeatedly broadcast updates about the suspect and his possible movements. Fortunately for the authorities, Imperatriz is not an overly large city, and the main roads leading out of the Planalto area are monitored by checkpoints. Only a few hours later, close to midday on October 9, an update came through the radio. A patrol unit had located and detained a man matching the description in the Bacuri district not far from the crime scene. The suspect appeared exhausted. Red stains believed to be blood were visible on his clothing, and he showed clear signs of mental distress. When surrounded by officers, he did not resist. Instead, he muttered incoherent phrases under his breath. Police also recovered a small knife from his possession. The manhunt ended only a few hours after the murder, demonstrating the rapid coordination of the Imperatriz police force. With W.J. Ginson now in custody, the investigation moved into its next phase, uncovering the motive behind the killing and reconstructing the full sequence of events that led to the brutal crime. At the police station, the suspect initially appeared confused and mentally unstable. However, after some time, he gradually admitted to the crime. According to investigators, Wid Ginson claimed he firmly believed that Malin had used brucia, a form of witchcraft spell, against him. Speaking in a calm, almost emotionless tone, he told officers, "That girl cursed me. I had to take her life to break the spell." The motive he described sounded irrational and deeply rooted in superstition. Yet, it became the key to understanding the strange and violent behavior that had led to the attack. As investigators continued digging into his background, they discovered that Wire Ginson had a long history of violence and signs of psychological instability. Police records revealed that he had previously assaulted members of his own family, including his mother and sisters. At one point, he even forced his mother out of the house. Because of these incidents, his family had reported him to authorities several times. Local courts had previously issued restraining orders to protect his mother and sisters from him. This meant that the suspect already had a documented record of domestic violence and had long been considered a dangerous individual within his own family. Although Wilkinson had not served a prison sentence, he had accumulated several reports at the local police station related to violent behavior and public disturbances. Neighbors recalled seeing officers visit his house multiple times after complaints about his aggressive outbursts. On several occasions, people reported hearing him shouting and cursing loudly in the middle of the night. One resident said they once saw him smashing objects inside his house while yelling that someone was trying to poison him. Local authorities had previously arranged for him to undergo evaluation at a provincial psychiatric hospital. However, Wilkinson refused to cooperate with long-term treatment. Eventually, after being rejected by his family, Wilkinson ended up living alone in the house in Planalto, ironically right next to Mylan's home. Residents in the area avoided interacting with him because he was considered strange and often confrontational. Some said he frequently shouted to himself and showed signs of paranoia, as if he constantly believed others were plotting against him. This unstable mental state created fertile ground for extreme superstitious beliefs to grow. When police searched Wilkinson's house, they recovered several items that added context to his claims. Inside the residence, investigators found books and documents related to spells, charms, and folk magic. Most disturbing was what they discovered inside his bedroom. Symbols resembling protective charms had been drawn on the walls, and cloves of garlic hung nearby objects, commonly associated with superstitious rituals meant to ward off evil spirits. Investigators also found a notebook containing chaotic, handwritten entries. Some lines read like threats: "The witch must fall," and "Destroy the demon woman before she destroys me." These writings suggested that Wilkinson had been nurturing the idea of eliminating a supposed witch for quite some time, waiting for the moment he believed was right to act. All the evidence pointed toward a deeply paranoid mindset and reinforced the motive he had confessed during interrogation. While the investigation continued, authorities began conducting detailed interviews with key witnesses. The first to be questioned were Mylan's 3 children. Because the children were very young and had suffered severe emotional shock, police invited a child psychologist to assist during questioning. Based on what the children described, their accounts closely matched the footage captured by the security camera. That morning, they said the older neighbor suddenly appeared behind their mother and attacked her with something very sharp, causing her to fall. Their mother began bleeding and tried to run away, while the children ran behind her, unable to keep up. The innocent testimony of the young children deeply moved everyone involved, while also serving as powerful evidence that strongly implicated Wilkinson. In addition, several neighbors who had witnessed parts of the incident from a distance provided consistent descriptions of the attacker's appearance and actions. All of them confirmed that the assailant was Wilkinson and that he acted alone. The forensic examination later determined that the victim died from severe head trauma combined with massive blood loss. 5 major wounds were documented on her head and arms, matching the injuries described at the crime scene. Forensic doctors also discovered a small fragment of metal embedded in the bone of the victim's arm, likely broken off from the blade of the sickle. The final forensic conclusion confirmed that the murder weapon was a sharp agricultural tool, such as a sickle, consistent with the object recovered by police at the scene. The estimated time of death was around 7:45 a.m., only minutes after the attack began. This indicated the extreme violence of the assault, which left the victim with almost no chance of survival. While investigators continued to strengthen the physical evidence, they also examined the relationship between the suspect and the victim to clarify the motive. People close to Mylan stated that she had never had any conflict with Wilkinson. This meant that the suspect's claim that Mylan had used witchcraft against him existed only in his own imagination and had no basis in reality. Some neighbors also revealed that Ginson had previously hinted that he might take someone's life. At the time, people dismissed those statements as the ramblings of an unstable man. Only later did they realize those words had foreshadowed the tragedy. By this stage, the overall picture of the case had become clearer. With Ginson Martin de Sousa, a man with a history of violence and apparent psychological instability, had developed the delusion that his neighbor, Mylan, was practicing witchcraft against him. Over time, this paranoia grew stronger until it finally erupted into the brutal attack. On the 10th of October 2025, the Imperatriz police concluded the initial stage of the investigation and transferred the case to the prosecutor's office. Weg Ginson was formally charged with intentional homicide with aggravating circumstances related to gender-based violence under Brazilian criminal law. That same day, just 1 day after the crime, the Imperatriz court held a preliminary hearing to determine whether the suspect should remain in custody. During this hearing, the judge reviewed the legality of the arrest and the condition of the accused. The court ultimately decided that With Ginson would remain in pre-trial detention while the investigation continued. This decision meant he would not be released on bail in order to prevent any possibility of escape or further danger to the community. At the hearing, Ginson appeared exhausted and disheveled. Wearing an orange prison uniform with his hands cuffed, he stared blankly while standing before the court. When the judge asked whether he understood the charges against him, he nodded but continued muttering about Macumba. A court-appointed defense lawyer requested that the suspect undergo a psychiatric evaluation before further legal proceedings could continue. The request was considered reasonable given Ginson's mental condition, which raised questions about his ability to fully understand his actions. However, prosecutors argued that the suspect had a documented history of violence and that the attack appeared to involve deliberate preparation. According to their argument, this suggested clear criminal intent rather than a completely unconscious act. The judge agreed that a psychiatric evaluation should be conducted, but ruled that With Ginson would remain in custody for the time being in order to protect public safety. In the final months of 2025, the case was expected to proceed to a public trial at the Criminal Court of Maranhão State. If convicted of killing a woman under Article 121 of the Brazilian Criminal Code, W. Ginson Martins de Sousa could face a prison sentence of 30 years or more. However, if the psychiatric evaluation were to determine that he suffered from a severe mental disorder that eliminated his ability to understand or control his actions, the court could rule him not criminally responsible. In that case, he would be placed in compulsory treatment at a psychiatric institution rather than serving a standard prison sentence. This possibility attracted significant public attention, as many people feared that the perpetrator might avoid traditional punishment by invoking mental illness. In Imperatriz, the case quickly became a major test for the justice system. Local public opinion, especially women's rights organizations, began demanding a strict and appropriate sentence. They argued that even if Ginson suffered from psychological issues, his actions were still influenced by misogyny and dangerous superstition, and therefore he should be held accountable. Lawyers representing the victim's family stated that they would ask the court to impose the maximum possible penalty for such a brutal crime. Meanwhile, the defense was expected to build its arguments around Ginson's mental health history in an effort to reduce his legal responsibility. Although the official trial had not yet taken place, the immediate legal outcome was already clear. Guy Ginson, Martin de Sousa, would remain in custody. On the 10th of October, 2025, after the preliminary hearing, he was transferred to the resocialization prison of Imperatriz. Prison officers later reported that even after entering his cell, Wire Ginson seemed confused and detached. At one point, he reportedly asked whether that witch was truly dead. The coldness of that remark only deepened the anger and grief of the victim's family. They now looked toward the upcoming trial as their final chance to obtain justice for Mylan. The trial was expected to take place in early 2026, and many believed that W. Ginson would likely receive a long prison sentence. Though it could not erase the tragedy, the legal process might at least bring some measure of justice for the children who had lost their mother. The case of W. Ginson Martins de Souza and the murder of Mylan Ridoasva remains a heartbreaking story, one that reflects both personal tragedy and broader social problems intertwined in a single act of violence. The community reacted with a mixture of deep sympathy and intense anger. People mourned the tragic fate of the young mother, while condemning the brutal actions of the attacker. Several local newspapers described the case as a crime with disturbing echoes of the Middle Ages. The accusation that a woman was practicing witchcraft, followed by her killing with a sickle, reminded many of the dark era of witch hunts in human history. It is difficult to believe that such an event could take place in 2025, in the middle of a modern city. The tragedy has become a stark reminder that education and mental health care must receive greater attention so that no one becomes a victim of violence fueled by fear and superstition. The lessons drawn from this case are painful but important. First, personal safety should never be taken for granted. Even in familiar neighborhoods or inside one's own home, awareness and caution remain essential. If someone notices threatening or unusual behavior nearby, reporting it to authorities immediately can make a critical difference. Early warnings may prevent a tragedy. Second, there is a clear need for stronger systems to monitor individuals with histories of violence or serious mental illness. The case of W. Ginson illustrates that a restraining order alone may not be enough. In situations involving repeated violent behavior or severe psychological instability, closer supervision or mandatory treatment may be necessary to prevent harm to innocent people. Above all, the case sends a clear message. Violence against women can never be justified, whether it hides behind superstition or any other excuse. In a civilized society, such acts must be confronted and punished. The crime committed by W. Ginson Martins de Souza stands as a painful example of how personal tragedy and broader social problems can collide, leaving lasting consequences for families and communities alike. In your view, after committing such a brutal crime, could Ginson avoid prison simply because he shows signs of mental illness? Share your thoughts in the comment section below, and remember to like and subscribe so you don't miss the latest videos.